brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
All right, so I guess we're going to go ahead and start, and I believe it's our episode 22. And we are going to continue with our adventures of Kurush, also known as Cyrus, also known as Kir, which was the first great Persian king known in history and oftentimes presented differently by different peoples. And I'm going to go ahead and try to pull up an image of him real quick, or at least an alleged image of him. Let me see if I can do my screen share correctly this time. So here we have one of the Persian kings anyway. Move you guys over here. And I have some other images. This is just kind of a representation of the holy flame of Zoroaster and of Ahura Mazda, something that the Persians held in very high regard. So, okay, I'm going to stop sharing. And so last time, again, this is our episode 22. We're doing the Persians, and shout out goes to Mervine. I'm mostly using his material for this podcast and some other material. So last time we finished our wonderful Kurush with the conquest of Lydia, where Zoroastrianism very rapidly was spreading throughout the kingdom of Lydia. Whereas we remember the Lydian aristocracy and the Lydian king were allowed to, according to some sources, were allowed to remain in power. Now, I just want to say, for the purpose of this podcast and the previous couple ones on the Persians, I'm not going for a strictly scientific story. What I'm going for is to represent the Persians in a way that they are almost never represented in the Western world, because most of the time we see the Persians from the point of view of the Greeks, which were their biggest enemies. And I'm trying to kind of present a Hollywood sort of adventure story in the same way that the movie 300 represented a Hollywood adventure story, except I'm trying to present it from the opposite side. So a lot of this is supposition. A lot of this is kind of basically based on the known research material. It's storytelling more so than scientific research. What I'm hoping will come out of this episode and my other Persian episodes, so that people will actually become interested in Persians and maybe go and research them themselves. So, like I said, Kurush has just conquered Lydia, and he has switched over more or less the local population to being good Zoroastrians, which is something that the Persians tended to do. But the way the Persians did it, unlike the Assyrians who came before them, the Persians did not really eradicate or subjugate the local gods. They were much more forgiving, and they were much more inclusive in their religious and cultural views. Their main thing was, you do not, I repeat, you do not, under any circumstances, do not harm your cow. You live with your cow, you milk your cow, you are friends with your cow, you treat your cow well, and everything is going to be well in the kingdom. Of course, with the spread of Zoroastrianism, it means that the local gods were either proclaimed to be Ahurs, which are the good gods, but that term mostly applies to the Persian deity. Here, I need to make a correction. Actually, Yazads were simply the leaders of the deities, the most holy, the most renowned, and the most righteous of the deities, kind of the lords of the deities, if you will, in the Zoroastrian pantheon. So the local gods were proclaimed Yazads, and other than that, the priesthood remained the same in Lydia. Their rituals were allowed to remain the same, with one exception: no bloody sacrifices and no sacrifices of cows. Another interesting thing that happened is because when the Persians came in, of course, you know, as any conquered territory, they started collecting taxes. Well, what the local population kind of found out, that interestingly enough, the Persian taxation seemed to be a little bit less than the previous Lydian state taxation. Well, why was that the case? Well, that was the case because Persians had a very interesting caste system. Now, we remember that all Aryan tribes have a tendency to have the three-layer caste system, where you have the priesthood class on top, the wise men, then you have your warrior society, and then you have your common people. By common people, I mean really tradesmen, herdsmen, anybody who does not belong to the warrior class. The main caste, and I'm just going to remind this, are the Atravan, which are your priests, Kshatripavan, which are your warrior caste, and then Astrivashayu, which are your commoners. The main classes that we're going to be very interested in this particular episode is going to be the Atravan, which is your priesthood, and your Kshatripavan. Now, the Indians, as you know, the Indian society is also broken up into the three main castes. But when the Indian society decided to add on to their caste system, they did so by adding a Shudra caste, that's the lowest caste on the bottom of the social ladder. Well, the Persians, they went a different route. They decided to also come up with a fourth caste in their society. But their fourth caste was placed right between the top and the middle caste. So right between the priesthood and the warrior caste, they instituted a new caste. And this caste were known as the Dipiran caste. And these were the intellectuals, these were the bureaucrats, these were the scientists, the poets, anybody who was really intelligentsia would be the Eastern term for this, the intellectuals class. And the awesome thing about the Persian society is that unlike in the Indian society, the Persians could easily move, well, not easily, but you could move between the castes. So if you were a warrior, for example, who was tired of doing war and you have brought home plenty of goods and you were ready to become a merchant, then you could go to the local heads of the merchant council and say that you would like to switch castes. And you could undergo very serious, very kind of, it's almost, I don't know if any of you have seen Babylon 5, but they have a similar concept in that particular show, where you can almost undergo a mutation and switch your class, your caste within the society. That's kind of how this worked. It was a difficult process, but it was definitely something that even, commoners could do. Another thing that was different about the Persian society is that the castes could intermarry. There was not really a ban on intermarriage between the people of different castes. And how that worked out, for example, if you were an Atravan and you married a woman who was from the warrior class, your children, all the female children, would be the same caste as the mother, and all the male children would be the same caste as the father. And Atravan schools, which normally educated just the priests, they started educating also this new Dipiran class. They started educating intellectuals. And these intellectuals started really focusing on their main task, which was state bureaucracy and accounting. And they were really good at this accounting, which was the reason why their ability to collect taxes was a little bit more advanced than the ability of the original Lydian aristocracy and bureaucrats who were doing this stuff. So at this point in time, having conquered Lydia, our Kurush was more or less ready to go back home and kind of get back to his state affairs when news came to him that there was some unrest happening in nearby Babylon. And he sat there and he went, but war, but Babylon, but war, but Babylon, but war. He sat there and thought about it for a while, but it was Babylon. What do you do? So instead of going right out to conquer, he did what he always did. He announces that the Babylonians are, in reality, they're all actually righteous people. They're all Ahura worshippers. And that the power in their country has been seized by basically a small corrupt elite of the devil worshippers. And that they, the good Persians, were going to help their brothers, the good Babylonian people, to free them from this horrible and oppressive regime. And with those messages, he started marching onto Babylon. Now, Babylonians have been kind of sick and tired of living under a pseudo-Assyrian state that their elite, that their new kingship has instituted upon them. And they really did not appreciate the fact that their gods were downgraded, that their idols of their gods have been taken to the capital. So when Kurush's army started coming towards the outskirts of Babylonian kingdom was the message that we're here to return your gods and to free you from the oppression of your very mistaken kings, the Babylonians did not really resist him terribly much. Well, when he arrived at the gates of Babylonian city, the Babylonian king himself, that was Balthazar at that time, came out to meet him in great battle. And Kurush defeated him soundly. And in this case, he was not merciful, unlike with the other ones. He announced that actually there was only one evil god, one evil deity in the whole kingdom of Babylonia, and that was the Devos Shin. We remember from last episode that Shin was the personal dynastic deity of the dynasty that was currently on the throne in Babylon. And he announced that the only bad really lineage within the entire country was those people who were the servants of this evil Shin, and that was the Babylonian king and his lineage. And so the king and his family got executed. Other than that, pretty much Kurush marched into Babylon with all the Babylonians, not terribly upset about the fact that he marches in. Well, the first thing that he does, he breaks the statue of Shin. And then he brings out onto the square the statues of Ishtar and of Marduk. He bows down to them. He brings them greetings from the great Ahura Mazda, and he shows them all the proper respect. Then he brings out all the little idols and big idols that have been collected by the Babylonian army from the various little towns and villages. And he basically says to his army, all right, now we got to do what's right. And his army starts taking these little idols and these big statues back to their home villages. And when he starts doing that and the people see that the new conqueror king is basically honoring their old gods, the holy gods of, the ancient land, the land of Sumer, the land of Akkadian, the land of Babylonia, he is seen as righteous and rightful king of Babylon. And of course, Kurush himself sees Babylon and it's Babylon, right? I mean, by this point in time, comparing to the history that Babylon has already known throughout all these centuries, the Persians are just kind of bare-threaded barbarians. And of course, Kurush decides to institute one of his main capitals in the city of Babylon. Now, the Persian Empire had multiple capitals, and what the court of the king usually did at early stages, it would migrate between the capitals, so they were still technically nomadic peoples. They would just migrate seasonally between different palaces. But definitely his favorite place, and the place where he later is going to be buried, is going to be Babylon. It's the gem of his entire, of his entire country, of his entire new. And now we cannot even speak of a Persian kingdom anymore. It's Persian Babylonian kingdom, because the Persians absorbed a lot of the culture, a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the style, a lot of the art, a lot of the ways of the old Babylonian people. And of course, the only problem that they really have is that Babylonians, well, they used to eating cows, right? And they can't eat cows anymore. Well, Kurush says, well, sorry, guys, would you rather have all your gods confiscated or just, kind of not eat cows? And that's left at that. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody has anything to say. Comments, questions, concerns? And I'm going to really quickly, while I'm taking a break, show a couple more pictures. They're in no particular order, but just some images. Some of these are just artistic images of what not much really remains. You see, by the way, you see this symbol right here? That's the symbol of Ahura Mazda. It's the symbol of the Holy Soul. It's the holy symbol of the Zoroastrian faith. Again, same symbol. And another thing that the Persians do when they conquer Babylon, of course, they adopt the system of writing that the Babylonians are using at this point in time. Now, the Persians, they had a way of marking numbers before that for their calculations for counting, but they did not have any written system, because it's the Persians, like a lot of Aryans at that stage, they still believe that written language should only be used for bureaucratic purposes, that things of religious importance, that things of of a sort of a sacred magnitude should definitely be orally transmitted and by no means murdered by being put down in any form of writing. This is just an image from a book of what it might have looked like when the Persians rolled into Babylon to conquer it. This is again an artistic representation. I think it's one of the later Babylonian kings, but that's the idea. Babylonian, aka Persian. This is actually kind of a good image. I mean, if we're thinking about what Persians may have looked like when they were still kind of out in the fields, I mean, this would probably be early Persia, early Media, outskirts of the what later will become the imperial territory, really. Get to my notes. So, Kurush is crowned in Babylon by Babylonians as the rightful Babylonian king. Now he has Babylon, and the Babylon has him. The Persian army delivers the little statues of gods back to the villages. There are celebrations all throughout the country. Kurush announces Babylon his main capital. And his people that he brings with him, the Diperan, the class, the intellectuals class, suddenly they become not just accountants and scientists. Not only do they expand their scientific knowledge, because Babylon is known for its scientific, for its astrological, astronomical, for its mathematical knowledge. They also become archivists. They become librarians, because there's so many written records stored in the city of Babylon from all these civilizations that are kind of sandwiched on top of each other. They're layered on top of each other, all the way back down to Sumer, through the history of Babylon, through Arcadia, through Assyria. There's a lot of records there. So the intellectual class really has a lot to occupy their minds. So Babylon starts blooming. There's a lot of trade going on. And Persians fall in love, of course, with Ishtar. How can you not fall in love with Ishtar? Ishtar is immediately declared an absolute Yazad. She is probably the most sacred of all the sacred gods that ever joined the pantheon, if you can call it that, of Ahura Mazda. Because what do you sacrifice to Ishtar? Well, you sacrifice sex to her. She never accepted bloody sacrifices. She's about as pure and holy of a goddess as you can have. And of course, it's Ishtar. It's the goddess of sex and war. So how could, the Persians not fall in love with her? So the cult of Ishtar actually spreads out throughout the Persian Empire. It's one of the very few local gods and goddesses that becomes very wildly and widely honored throughout the empire. Let's see. So Kurush, by this point in time, he's old. He's achieved. I mean, there's some other conquests going on the side, but time goes on. Babylon is blooming. Persian Empire is nice and stable. Kurush is getting old. He's getting old. He is rich. He's tired. He is bored. He has plenty of children. He has 2 wonderful sons that he has raised. So he's fine for as far as his heirs go. He has 4 grown daughters, and he does not want to die in his bed. So Kurush decides that he is going to die, as his ancestors have before him, in glorious battle. And he puts out a cry across the land to all his old veterans. Who would like to go with him? Basically on a conquest, on a kind of exploration march to the unknown lands, to the outskirts of their territory and the territory that they know. And surprisingly, a lot of old men show up. I don't know if any of you have read Terry Pratchett. Anybody? The Last Hero, the book Last Hero, I highly recommend it to anyone. It's a very humorous, on the one hand, book, but it's kind of centered around the same theme, to where a very old, very glorious conqueror does not want to die old in his bed. So he gathers up all his old men, and they all together go to make war in a suicidal, final, glorious thrust outwards. So they march, and he leaves the throne to his heirs, and he marches to go across Dardanelles. He goes along the Black Sea. He goes north to the Balkans, conquering the local tribes in the process. And he goes basically to the territory of modern-day Ukraine. And he comes across the Masaget people. Now, the Masaget people, there's one of the people that belong to the Scythian world. They're Aryans, just like the Persians, but they're Aryans that stayed back in Aryan voyage in those territories. And the queen that rules this tribe is a glorious queen, Temerida. And she is actually, a movie really recently has come out in the state of Kazakhstan that's dedicated to her, because she's very much a legendary character for the steppe people, of any steppe people throughout history, even though she was a Scythian and not a Scythian related tribe. But she was really glorious and a fantastic warrior queen. And so this army starts a war. This army of old men starts kind of a suicidal war against the overbearing enemy armies, and they fight and they fight and they fight and they fight. And he sends a message to the queen. He says, Temerida, you need to submit to me. You need to bow and to me and swear allegiance to me. And she says, what the heck, I'm not going to. Who are you? What are you doing here? Where did you come from, weird old people? So they continue to do war, and in one of the battles, Kurush is actually killed. Kurush is actually killed. He is beheaded. And, the last few veterans who are surrounded, and there's maybe 200 of them left by this point in time, they're brought to the queen, and the queen says, what the heck? Who are you people? What do you want? What are you doing here? And they say, well, our great king Kurush, he didn't want to die old on the throne, so he decided to die glorious death. And that's why we came here, to do glorious war upon you, to die like men should die, and not in our soft, women, basically women's beds. And the Scythians hear that, and they say, that's pretty cool. That's pretty glorious, because they're the same kind of warrior type people that the Persians are. And so the Meridish orders to locate the head of Kurush. She returns his body to his men, and she sends whatever, 200 old veterans back to the city of Babylon with his more or less preserved remains. And so he's brought back to Babylon, and he is buried. He is buried in Babylon in a small traditional, basically tomb that's not very particularly decorative, that is not particularly large. It's just plain stone tomb, and on its lid, on its cover, it says basically very short sentence. It says, I am Kurush, king, and that's it. When Alexander the Great, much later, comes to these lands conquering, he is going to be very curious to see the grave of this great conqueror, of this fantastic king. And when he sees the grave and how very not enormous, not overly gaudy it is, how very simple and how very stark it is, Alexander the Great says, yes, I want to be buried like this. I want to be remembered as this man was remembered. Of course, we all know that unfortunately Alexander did not get his wish, but he was very impressed by this very simple, stark statement of one man's glory. So we were trying to find, David mostly was looking for some pictures of, the early meets from the previous podcast. And yeah, there's not a lot. So, some of these are not very accurate representations. Some of these are artistic reconstructions, but these are the images we were able to find. I mean, not all of these are period, right? I mean, some of these are just kind of recreations of what they might have looked like. This right here is, based on the bas-relief. It's some, artistic representation of what that person might have looked like. Again, some of, little statuettes. This I already showed it's a mosaic. Some of their artwork, so you see the same Babylonian and Assyrian type beards, because that style just became almost eternal. Let's stop here for a second. But yeah, I mean, they really did adopt a lot of the Babylonian and Assyrian ways of dressing, ways of decorating themselves, ways of wearing their hair, and so on and so forth, especially the beards. And we were David was trying to find some images of the women, and it's really hard to find images of the women. Did I talk about Persian marriage last time at all? The interesting bit about the Persian marriage, anybody?
I don't recall that.
Okay, so Persians, let me stop sharing. So Persians had a very unique experiment, and for them it worked out. It didn't work out for any other nation who tried it, but the Persians seemed to not be harmed by it at all. Part of the Zoroastrian doctrine was that if you have a sister, your best wife you should have is going to be your sister. And that was not just for the ruling class like it was, in Egypt with the pharaohs. This was for everyone. So any noble Zoroastrian Persian, if he had any sisters, he would marry the sisters. You could marry more than one. Configuration of marriages, it could be one wife, multiple husbands, one husband, multiple wives. If you didn't have a sister, you married your cousin, or you married your twice removed nephew, or niece or nephew, or somebody who was blood relative. The idea was that you know your family members, you love your family members, you will never harm your sister knows you. So the best potential mate for you is going to be somebody that you grew up with as a child. that it is very counterintuitive, oftentimes does lead to genetic degradation of the population, but that really depends on what the genetics were like to begin with, and it seems like the Persians were pretty good with their genetic pool because that didn't seem to affect them a lot. But a lot of them do look very similar to each other because there was a lot of that inbreeding going on. But that's just a unique Persian thing. All right, any comments, questions, thoughts before I go on? Somebody doesn't start talking, I think I'm gonna be sad. All right, then I'm going to continue. So our wonderful Kurush, he is dead. And now who is going to take the throne after him? Well, Kurush had two sons whom he has groomed for the throne. One of his sons, he sent to be an Atravan, an actual priest. And that son's name was Bardia. The other one of his sons, Cambodia, and that has no correlation to the country. It's just a phonetic correlation. Cambodia was sent to be trained to be a warrior, and because before he left for his great journey onto death and glory, Kurush thought that Persia might still be facing some military turmoil. He nominated Cambodia, his warrior son, to be the king. So as soon as Kurush's body was brought to the capital, to the new capital Babylon, and buried, the younger brother, well, I'm not even sure if he was younger, just the brother who did not get named to be the heir, started plotting against his brother. And Cambodia, being Cambodia, he was not terribly bright. It's oftentimes, nature rests on the children of the great men and women, and great rulers oftentimes have very not so great offspring. Cambodia went on and killed his brother. And the entire Persian Empire said, what? And it didn't make a lot of sense to people, especially people who were away from the events that took place, why on earth he would go and kill his brother. Because it's one thing, okay, if you want to take the throne and your brother is already the king, that makes sense for you to basically kill your brother and to seize the throne. But your brother was not even the rightful heir. You're the heir, so why on earth would you kill your brother? And of course, there's such concept as Hvarna in Persian and in Zoroastrian mentality, and that's the idea of that king's glory, charm, his luck, his charisma, and his righteousness before the gods. And of course, such thing as killing your blood brother by the Persians was absolutely not considered to be an okay thing. So the empire started looking very questionably at Cambodia. And Cambodia looked left and he looked right and he thought, aha, I know how to fix my reputation. A little glorious war would do great. And so first he proposed that they go and attack the Scythians. And his army looked at him and said, the Scythians? Really? First of all, your father just got off by them. Second of all, what are we going to take from the Scythians? They have nothing. Okay. Cambodia scratched his head and came up with the same brilliant idea as many others before him. Aha, there's Egypt. Why don't we go and attack Egypt? And by this point in time, the Persians already had a great military layover base. Of course, Israel, because as we remember, the Babylonian dynasty, they took the majority of the population of Israel into Babylonian captivity. Well, when Kurush conquered Babylon, the Jewish people came to him and they said, we've been relocated here forcibly. He said, okay, go home. That's fine. You're free to go home. But we have no temple, said, the Jewish people. Our temple has been destroyed by the conquering Babylonians. Oh my gosh, said Kurush. Temple, give them some money, build them a new temple, whatever, and send them off on their way. So they got sent off on their way, rejoicing, and happy Israelites went home with, architects and workers and money to build a new temple with. And actually in the entire Old Testament, the only positive, the only praised foreign Goya king really is Kurush, who is considered to be almost, are you sure your mother wasn't Jewish? That kind of thing. No, his mother definitely wasn't Jewish, but, to him it was no big deal. He had a lot of little tribes like that. A tribe of, 1 million some odd people to somebody who ruled an empire as large as Persia was at that point in time was nothing. So Israelites were very favorably inclined towards the Persians by this point in time. And so Cambodia marched, he marched through Israel, got his supplies, and he headed towards Egypt. And at first he was fairly successful. He took the lower parts of Egypt, and he took he approached the city of what the Greeks called the Egyptian Thebes. And And I'm going to try to look up the name of this city because I cannot pronounce it for the life of me. Faucet was the Egyptian name for the city. So Thebes was what the Greeks called it, because Greeks like to call everything Greek terms. And so as Cambodia's army was approaching the city, a festival was taking place in the city of Thebes. And it was the great and important festival of the great bull that was dedicated to the great god Ra. You know, as you, I'm sure, have heard from different, you know, I don't know, documentaries and books and everything else, stories about Egypt. You know, there was a great bull who was considered to be representative of the god Ra on earth. And at the time as the battle was raging, this new bull was being basically crowned to be the living representation of the god Ra. So the Persian army is trying to break towards the center of the city. Of course, the Egyptians fight like crazy, because if you don't crown this bull, that's it. The world is going to end. Nile is not going to flow anymore. It's going to be catastrophe. So they fight desperately. And of course, the more the Egyptians try to defend that center square and the temple there, the more, of course, the Persians want to know what's going on, and they start breaking through the troops. Bottom line is, in the melee and everything that goes down, somehow the bull gets killed. And the Persians take the city. And a few of the remaining Egyptian priests get brought before Cambodia. And, you know, he wants to know what was that all about? What were they defending? Was it some great treasure? Was it a great king? They say it was a bull. He said it was a holy bull that we were going to crown to be our, you know, God's representation on this planet. Aha, say the Persians. You worship a cow. You were in the process of crowning a holy cow. And we killed the cow. So we attacked somebody who is definitely Ahura worshippers, who are definitely all kinds of people, and we slaughtered the holy cow. Cambodia's right-hand man, you know, he was his kind of commander-in-chief who cleared the way for the army to get onto the square where this bull got killed. Immediately commit suicide. The priests could, and the army, all the Atravans in the army, put out their holy flames that they've been traveling with, pack up, turn around, and march home. With the news of this dynasty is cursed, their Hwarna is gone, they attack the peoples that are righteous Ahura worshippers, they have slaughtered a holy cow, gods have turned away from us. Cambodia is stuck in the city of Thebes, which he's already taken, with whatever army is left with him. Of course, Egyptians from all over Egypt are coming at him like crazy. I mean, because at this point in time, it's sacrilege. It's the end of the world. They try to barricade themselves within the city. And that's when news comes to them, comes to Cambodia from back home in Babylon. And the messengers that come, they say, you know, King, your brother, Bordia, he has risen a revolt against you back in Babylon. And of course, Cambodia says, who raised a revolt against me in Babylon? My dead brother? I must be cursed. At this point in time, Cambodia is more or less goes just insane. I mean, with all these horrible events that took place, that, you know, was the sacrilege that he has committed by slaughtering the holy bull, he believes that, yes, this must be his punishment from the gods, that his brother truly came back to life and he's truly rising up in revolt against him. He leaves some forces still to defend the Thebes in there, and he grabs his elite guards and his elite troops, and he does basically a dash march across the Sinai desert back home. In the process of which, because he does not stop to take breaks for water, for rest, for food, he basically gets a heat stroke and dies. Egyptians say, aha, so our great god Ra has punished this sacrilegious monster. Whatever army is left back in the city of Thebes is just stuck there trying to defend itself desperately against all of Egypt. Meanwhile, in Babylon, the Atravan caste, once the messengers, all the priests returned from the great army from their war against Egypt, they brought the news that, our king has sinned terribly. He has slaughtered a holy cow. We attacked the wrong people. We have done an unrighteous and wrongful thing. We are cursed. The Atravans, among them rises a man who calls himself Bardia, who claims to be Bardia, who may not look like Bardia. Of course, this is not a time of the internet. No, not a lot of people know what Bardia looks like. And he seizes the throne. Some people say, yeah, that must be Bardia. This must be the king, the former king's brother. Some people say, wait a minute, he does not, we knew Bardia, he does not look like Bardia. So there's unrest going on in Persia. Of course, when you have unrest going on in Persia, very, very quickly the provinces start rising up. Lydia rises up, all the other conquered lands around the outskirts, the little Greek colony states nearby, they all start rising up. And even in Babylon, there's unrest. And this is where the empire probably would have fallen and disappeared. But a young man comes to the scene who kind of saves the day. I'm going to stop for a second and see if anybody has anything to say.
I don't want to interfere in the Hollywood version of events, but there are some other versions of the story that are that's being about to be told here about Darius and one I happened to catch it on Kings and Generals not too long ago. But just be aware, history is written by the victors.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and of course, there's a lot of legends. I mean, and here's the thing about the Persians. A lot of the material, like I've already said, we have about the Persians truly does come from the Greeks. The Greeks were great. They loved a good story. They really loved, they didn't love the Persians, I'll put it this way, because to the Persians, the Greeks were questionable worshippers, and to the Greeks, the Persians were also questionable worshippers. I mean, Zeus downright is one of the devices, so, because you sacrifice cows to Zeus, for example. So there was some, to put it mildly, lots of tension and friction between those two peoples. And the Greeks really like to tell very fantastical tales oftentimes. So a lot of the accounts that you get, again, it's the Persians themselves did not really write down a lot of their historical events. They mostly, what we know about them is usually from nearby tribes or much later records when they actually started keeping their own written records. But like I said, we have been exposed all our lives, especially through the lovely movie 300, which, portrays Xerxes, for example, as something unspeakable. I can't even begin to describe. Anyhow, and Darius has definitely never been portrayed very positively, I think, in the Western perspective. So that's why I want to give them the credit that is due. And if people are interested in, further historical facts and various different theories, I think it would be awesome if people went back to the sources and kind of looked at what's out there in the current scientific research. But I find these characters to be very fascinating and very interesting and very worthwhile. No less charismatic, no less interesting than Napoleon, than a lot of other Western, than Alexander the Great, even all the typical heroes of our Western reality. So while all this unrest is going on, and the empire is cracking at the seams, and various provinces are falling off, and everything is in disarray, and the morale of the people is completely just down. A young man from the outskirts of the empire comes riding into Babylon. His name, of course, he's known as Darius to us in the West. Again, that's Greek version. His actual name was Darius. Darius is about 16 years old, and he is coming to claim the throne. He has a good claim to the throne because his mother is the oldest daughter of Kurush. And as we remember in the Aryan, lineages and their laws, female had every right to be an heir. And since his mother is the oldest daughter, he is the oldest son of the oldest daughter. He is seizing the throne as a regent for his mother, which is very different than what we see in the Western world. In the Western world, usually it's the mother that seizes the throne as a regent for her son, right? Well, here it's exactly in reverse. He is heading for the capital, and of course his advisors tell him, whatever you do, do not kill your uncle. We don't know if he's real or he's not, but if another kind of inter-family bloodshed happens, that's not going to be good for you. Well, he's lucky one way or another. Bardia gets, the false Bardia or the person claiming to be Bardia, he gets killed before Darius is able to really do anything much about him. Oh, we've got people joining us again. By the way, everybody who's joined recently, welcome. Hi, it's really good to have you. So first thing that Darius does is he brings in all the Babylonians. Now you got to remember, Babylonian people have been in the state of more or less disarray and war and kind of civil unrest for over 4 centuries, if not probably about 5 centuries by now. I mean, they had the Assyrians there. They had this dynasty that was not good, the Balthazar dynasty. They're tired of the turmoil. They just want peace. They want quiet. They want a good, calm life. They enjoyed their life the way it was under the rule of Kurush. And first thing, of course, Darius does is he promises the Babylonians, look, just back me on this, and I promise you, I will bring everything back just to the way that it was during my grandfather's rule. I promise you. Swear. The next thing is that he does is he sends out his people throughout whatever lands he has access to search for a black bull with a white star on his forehead. That is number one priority. While that's going on, he does another brilliant thing. He pretty much spends the entire savings that the crown has by this point in time, and he literally bribes and purchases the local Greek colonies. And then he takes the troops, the Greek soldiers from those city-states that he more or less buys, and he throws them against the parts of the empire that are rebelling. So eventually the Norse, swears allegiance to him. He manages to bring Lydia back under the control. They later on, Persians make an agreement with Phoenicians, who more or less become the navy for the Persian Empire. He's in the middle of war. He heads east here, and he enters into negotiation with the local, wild Persian clan leaders, and explains to them that, look, I am the grandson of the great Kurush. I promise you everything is going to be as it was under my grandfather. Do you really want to do war? Do we need to do this to Aryan voyage? Do we need to do this to our new Aryan voyage, our new homeland? I mean, we've already done it back home. Let's unite. Either through war, through negotiations, one way or another, he manages to bring the empire back together. And while all this is going down, his people come back and they bring back to him the perfect cow with that black bull with a white star on its forehead. And Darius, he takes this bull and he travels to Egypt, where the last remains of whatever's left of the formerly glorious Persian army is hunkered down, under onslaught of absolutely outraged Egyptians who are pretty much thinking apocalypse is upon us. We're about to die. The world is about to end. He breaks through to the local priests and he says, we're very sorry. We made a horrible political and religious mistake. We have committed a terrible sacrilege, but I'm here to make everything right. Of course, the Persian army that's still stationed there, that's still fighting there, are just in complete disbelief, because the new king, the righteous, the rightful king, the blood of actual Kurush came to their rescue. They thought that they were damned. They thought that that was over for them. They thought that gods have turned against them and they were just nobodies. Suddenly the king comes, and not only does the king come, but the king redeems them by bringing this bull to replace basically the holy bull that they accidentally slew. And he says, okay, boys, while we're here already anyway, why don't we just finish taking Egypt? And he more or less continues his campaign against Egypt, but he continues his campaign under the propaganda of the fact that, look, yes, we did a great wrong. We killed your holy bull. But we have brought you a new holy bull. And this holy bull we're going to finish the ceremony that was so horribly interrupted. And we are going to crown this new bull as the proper representative of Ra on earth. He goes to the local priests and he learns from them all the details of the ritual. And he conducts the proper ritual correctly. He crowns the bull. And of course, who is the person who in Egypt crowns the bull? Well, that's the pharaoh. Of course, the local Egyptian, pretenders to the throne try to say that this is all false, this is a false bull. But that's where Egyptian faith, the Egyptian religion goes against the Egyptians themselves. Because guess what? The Nile is still flowing. The world hasn't ended. So it might be the right bull, and he must be the righteous king. And besides, very recently, they had proof that their gods did their jobs, right? Because the evil man who came and slew the bull got, struck down by heat stroke. So obviously the gods are very functional. And so one way or another, Darius, Kurush's grandson, is proclaimed to be the pharaoh of Egypt. Now, of course, he does not want to live in Egypt. Persians don't like Egypt. Egypt is kind of scary to Persians, but it's a very rich land. So they basically formally nominate Egypt to be their province, and then they basically require kind of taxes and sort of certain tributes, certain amount of goods from Egypt. But they do not really live there. They just leave us, X amount of military station there to kind of contain the province, but they depart back to their homeland after that. I'm going to stop and see if anybody has anything to jump in with. Go ahead.
Very briefly, can you hear me?
Yeah.
There's this very deep-seated animosity throughout history between the East and the West.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes up again and again between the Greeks and the Persians. At this point, it's the Greeks and the Persians, but you could even go back, let's say, for instance, the Trojan War.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems there's like a perpetual cultural animosity between the East and the West. And it's like, even though it may be hundreds of years old, they won't let go or unremember the injustices of the past.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, we still live in a world that's pretty much the East and the Western, Byzantine Empire, the East and Western Roman Empire. Basically.
If I may.
Yeah, of course.
Sure. Thanks, guys, for letting me join. First off, to answer Nathan's question, the East and West fight that's always been was based on the fact that the Greeks always preferred some form of democratic republic, i.e. a popular people, whereas most of the Persian Empire and most of the Middle Eastern empires always had a king or a sovereign lord that was righteous to the creator, so to speak, without getting too religious in it. So you have two very opposed ideologies. One is, I'm going to follow a solid king who is going to dictate, hopefully benevolently, or I'm going to follow the will of the people. And that conflict has continued for if you go back as far as, the new discovery in Turkey, potentially tens of thousands of years. So you're looking at the real animosity is not between the people and the gods, because, your original, in the common Latin, I believe it's Circes, that's, or Cyrus said that he wanted to respect all the lords or gods. So he appealed to the people, which was something that even the Democratic Republic of Athens would not do. You were either a plebe, for lack of better terms, or you were something greater. So the animosity is really not within the religious construct, it's within the governing construct. So, I mean, there's more dynamics to it than that, but really it is a geopolitical structure of populist rule under a democratic republic or a monarchy, for a lack of words. And I'll shut my muzzle now.
Well, and I think that's actually a very valid answer. And we will talk a lot more about that. Is a valid point. I didn't bring it up just because, I try to avoid political subjects. And I mean, and that doesn't just apply to the East. It applies also, to this. I mean, there's also the whole standoff between the enlightened democracy and the barbarians, right? Oftentimes the democratic states viewed everybody who was not democratic as barbarians, Tartars, Mongols, Scythians, barbarians, to where these so-called barbarian people oftentimes were more cultured and far more advanced, society-wise, science-wise, so in every way, shape, and form. Democracy, and we will talk about it a lot more once we get back to the new wave of the Greeks. It was a very unique, very narrow, very local phenomenon that could have only occurred. I mean, semi-republic formations have popped up here and there, usually in the trade cities throughout the world. But as far as democracy, as the way that it existed when it actually existed in the Greek city-states, could have only been born under the circumstances under which it was born, on the territory where it was born, that was extremely poor in resources, extremely poor in land, extremely overpopulated, where every scrap, of land pretty much had to be fought for, and where the entire male population of any, and where those city-states were so tiny that every single person more or less knew each other, and every single male had to participate in defending of that land, because the moment you lost that scrap of land, you lost your citizenship in this little city-state. And the moment you lost your citizenship, you stopped basically being a person. So it was a very complicated, very convoluted matter. But yes, there was always has been a standoff, and it's quite frankly somewhat unfortunate, because it does go very long time back. I don't remember where I stopped. Can somebody remind me, pretty please?
Darius.
Oh, he comes back from Egypt. That's right. We might even make it on time. Again, so Darius comes back. Darius, he comes back, and he pretty much tries to avoid war best he can for the rest of his rule, because he's had plenty of that, and his intention is to have a nice, peaceful, calm, basically empire by this point in time. Now, of course, there's a war that he's going to get very much engaged in towards the end of his life, and that's what we're going to be talking about when we get closer to talking about the Greeks. But while he's in Egypt, he does some of the things that are very like what his grandfather did. I mean, there was definitely his grandfather's blood in him. He travels to the local temples and honors all the local gods, and admits that they're definitely Yazads, they're definitely Ahurs, they're definitely positive deities. He restored, because when originally the Persian army was rolling over Egypt, they looted some of the burials of the Egyptian nobility and kings. He makes sure that those goods are restored best that he can. I mean, he makes peace with the gods. He's very much following in his grandfather's footsteps. And that's when he goes home, and he thinks he's going to have a peaceful time. And at this time, a strange thing happens. He gets raided. They started getting raids on the outskirts, and those raids are coming from India. Now, Indians and the Persians have went their separate ways quite some time before. And we remember that in India, they actually do worship the devils, because the main gods of the Hindu people are the devils gods. They're the glorious, shining, chariot-riding warrior gods that the Persians have proclaimed to basically be the devils. So the Indians and the Persians, they literally consider the other one to be more or less a Satanist. And these raids are happening because some great events have taken place in India. There has been consolidation of the United States, then, all that fell apart. There's warfare going on. And so these different groups and starting to raid the Persian territory. And so, of course, Darius has no choice but to raise his army, and he marches towards that territory. And he conquers a chunk of India, not a very big one, but he does conquer a chunk of India. And he proclaims this to be the province of Hindu. And of course, during these raids, they actually capture some Indian warriors, and they bring them back to the capital. And guess what? For the first time since the formation of Persia, they have real Devas worshippers. And, because they're brought out before, he makes a big PR action out of it. He brings them out in front of the people. He says, "Whom do you worship?" And they say, "Oh, we worship the glorious Indra. We worship the, basically a Rudra," which is going to be Shiva later on, real live Devas worshippers. And guess what? He's the first Persian king who was able to defeat the Devas worshippers, real life ones, not wannabe, not pretend, not sort of kind of real Devas worshippers. Of course, he names that chunk of land that he conquered to be the Hindu, and he proclaims that he has conquered all of India. And at this point in time, of course, he is renowned as the righteous king who brought back together all the former people from Aryan Voyage, all of their brothers under one hand, and he has established the victory against the evil gods and spread the light of Ahura Mazda to everyone across the land. And he manages to put up a stela where he says that he has conquered Hindu, and his Farna is huge, and he's the greatest king that has ever lived, and everybody should bow down to him, because that's what you do when you're a great king in the East, right? And so Darius is actually proclaimed with a very amazing title. He is known as Darius Vishtaspa. Vishtaspa, as we remember, was the original warrior king who led the people who later became the Persians out of a very Aryan voyage. And so he's basically proclaimed, I don't know, like the second coming in a way, except that original Vishtaspa, he led the people, he ran away from the other, from the Devas worshippers. And our great king, Darius, he has actually made the Devas worshippers bow down to us. He conquered them. So he's the greatest, most amazing, most righteous, most Varna endowed king in the history of the Persian people. And Egypt at this point in time remains a vassal land that's paying tribute to Persia, but more or less is governing itself because it's Egypt and it's always done that. But for the first time in its history, Egypt is included as a part of another empire. And even though it's technically kind of a separate land of its own, of course, on all the official documents, it's listed as being a part of Persia. So he dedicates the second part of his life to great construction and improvement projects within his new empire. And what he starts is an amazing construction project of connecting the empire from one end to another with interesting kinds of roads. Now, the Persians, they did not build the roads like the Romans did, because the Romans mostly had marching infantry, right? So their roads were hard stone. The Persians, they took a technology from the Hittites, which was a very interesting technology because they mostly had chariots at that point in time. And for the chariots, the hard stone is not the best way to be traveling. So what they would do is they would do layers of drainage and, dirt and various, what's the word for it? Like peat and stuff like that, gravel and things like that, and then plant grass in it. So what they would have would be these roads that are made up more or less of lawns that stretch, and you can still see some vestiges of those roads in certain parts of that territory. I mean, but these kind of long stretches of grass, soft grass-covered roads, they connected the entire empire end to end to where a messenger could go from one end of empire to another. And of course, this is a project that was absolutely enormous, and it took much longer than the lengths of Darius's life to actually finish it. But it was his great legacy for the Persian people. And this is where I think I want to stop with this part of the Persian story. And I think on the next podcast, well, before I continue with that, does anybody have any questions, comments, or thoughts? Anyone?
I would just say that I've never heard about that being done in Persia, that road design.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that being a very practical design, actually.
Okay, David wants to jump in. Somebody else talking?
Approximately 1,200 years before Cyrus, the northern Indian Indo-Europeans that would invade India were basically the same people as the Persians and the Scythians and other Iranian-speaking tribes. They would split off. You remember several episodes ago, we talked about the Mitanni. They were apparently related to the Indians. They were one of the first, because the gods they speak of in the Hittite treaties are the same gods as right. But some of that east-west is also Indo-European splits. The Iranian Indian, that they call them the Indo-Aryans, were one group, and then generally the Western peoples were that spoke Centum languages were another group. But it's a long time, a lot of peoples and a lot of mixing. But yeah, I think that Persia was unique in not only with Egypt, but with most of their territories They were very tolerant. They learned from the Syrians, and they learned from the short-lived Babylonian Empire. You can't just run over people. And so they got their taxes, they got their, what they needed, but they weren't oppressive, really. They were relatively tolerant as empires went. That's all.
And just one more notice since David brought up Mitanni. Remember, we talked about the three main warrior gods that there were. There was the Indra, well, not the Indra. There was Indra, there was Mithra, and then there was Rudra. Now, Indra became the top god of the Indians, right? And they also kept Rudra in the form of Shiva. The Persians, they kept Mithra because Mithra. So Rudra was, to those of you who may have not heard the previous episode, so Indra was the god of a kind of warrior glory, of, the joyful, glorious warfare. Mithra was the god of not the kings, but the king's immediate kind of surrounding warriors, kind of middle rank and file warrior. He was the god of thought out, reasonable warfare. He was the god also of treaties and truce and agreements, and he was a god that warriors would swear by if they wanted to make an agreement among themselves. And Rudra was the god of absolute, almost berserker rage. I mean, when Rudra went out, that's what his name means. It's from the the word red comes from the same root. It's because everywhere he went, there was just blood and guts and limbs flying everywhere. So Mitanni, actually, they had both gods in their pantheon. They had twin brothers of Mithra and Indra, and they honored them both. The Indians kept the Indra as their central character, and early on, of course. And the Persians, they took Mithra, and they came up with this whole story of how Mithra was originally one of the Devases, but then he renounced his association with those evil killer gods, basically, because they thought that those gods were just gods that brought death and destruction and savage suffering to people just for the sake of their own gain and joyful warfare. But they said that Mithra actually renounced his ways, and he joined Ahura Mazda's pantheon, and so they kept Mithra. And much later on in Roman religious pantheon, we will see that Mithra will also be very much venerated, though he is going to be perverted as far as the Persian perception of him goes very greatly. And yes, the Persians were extremely tolerant. As long as you did not harm your cow, you were nice to dogs and do not shit or piss in the river. That was the main intolerance factor. Now, interestingly enough, Persians, because they did incorporate a lot of the Greek city-states that were right there in the region, they did make exceptions for this, as far as not being able to consume, basically cow meat. They did make certain exceptions for the Greeks that lived in their territory, as long as they did not do it in sight of the religious Persians, as long as basically there were posted warning signs that do not enter this restaurant. You might see horrible abominable things. No good worshiping Zoroastrian should enter this cafe. I mean, they were allowed to actually practice their ritual and their the custom culinary practices, as long as it was the heck out of the sight of the main roads and the good Persian people. So they were even tolerant as far as that went. So yeah. Anyone else wants to say anything before we wrap up? Everybody's terribly quiet today. Makes me worried. All right, guys. Well, what I want to do, since it seems to be the logical jump, I want to start on the Scythian world, since we talked about the Massagets a little bit today, on the story of the death of Kurush. I want to start talking about the Scythians, because that is a whole world of very many, very diverse tribes that lasted quite a long time, and that, existed in parallel with the Western world for quite many centuries, and that is really underrepresented, I think, in the Western historiographies. And it's one of the things that I want to, all the nomadic cultures, the Scythian world cultures and their progression is something that I really want to cover in depth. So I want to start at least with some basic formation of the Scythians and where that whole collective of tribes came from in the next episode, if everyone is okay with that.
Yeah, very briefly, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to make a comment earlier. I had my mute on. But it'd be interesting, back then, to sit around a coffee shop or a brew hall, and the local conversation and what people are talking about. And I suspect that the conversation of religion, politics, would not be a whole lot different than it is today.
No, agreed.
I think you brought that up before at some point, Nathan, when we were talking about Babylon, and it seems likely, actually, overall.
Well,
Yeah.
humans don't seem to change very much over time. I mean, it's they talk about the spiral of history. I mean, humans as individuals, it's funny, we think about the scientific progress and all these improvements, but if you read some of the ancient Greek tragedies, for example, some of the works of writing of, early, I mean, name any culture really. I mean, as far as the depth, the complexity of the human thought, it hasn't really evolved that much. It hasn't changed a lot. What changed is mainly the technology. Go ahead.
People often talk about how we're following the Bronze Age ideas, but in fact, humans haven't really changed much in several thousand years.
Right, it's just too short of a time for any sort of major change or evolution. Though we're sure trying to speed it up with, the mass processed food, and it's the same way we sped it up in our dogs, right? By feeding them this pre-digested food, making their guts shrink. And again, it's mostly physiological. It's not really mental changes that are happening. But,
If I may,
of course.
if you all take a look at the history of civilizations that had tolerant religious and education practices, you will find that there was a great exchange of information and tolerant exchange of ideas. It's only when you got to a closed society that we come upon, the dark ages. So, I mean, but we as humans want to expand our ideas in these societies that had these type of open enlightenments. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson studied the great Persians and had copies of their documents to help found this. So it's really cool that we do have that. But anyway, I just thought I'd add that to you.
Yeah, well, and another thing is the word empire has a very negative connotation to it in modern ideology, I guess. The thing is, empires in general tend to be more or less tolerant. At least they attempt to be more or less inclusive, because empires by default they consist of, patchwork population. They consist of multiple different peoples. And so they have to be tolerant much more so than any sort of kind of mono-ethnic or semi-mono-ethnic or, mono-religious state formation. So there seems to be a little bit more acceptance and tolerance in an imperial setup than there is in anything that is more exclusive, or rather, exclusive, I would say. But that's pretty much just, I guess, the result of formation. And we're getting into more political debate here, which I desperately try to avoid. But okay, so I'm thinking next time would be on April 8th. Does that work for everyone? See you 2 weeks from now.
In 2 weeks.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah, I gotta exit out of this. I don't know how to exit out of this. I'm having technical difficulties. I have a stupid thing open. I don't know how to make it close. Darn it. Okay, now we're gonna close the meeting. Bye, guys.
Orange glow of a campfire, pale electrical glow. Both cast out shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.